The macabre history of the Mullers. They hid 7 children underground for 20 years. In the bitter winter of 1807, when Napoleon's armies cast their shadow across the European continent, and the old world trembled with uncertainty, the remote village of Grauberg, nestled in the Bavarian highlands, remained untouched by the great wars that raged beyond its borders. This forgotten settlement, home to fewer than 200 souls, clung to the mountainside like a collection of weathered stones, its timber and stone houses huddled together against the perpetual mist that rolled down from the peaks above. Village had existed for centuries, its inhabitants bound together by ancient traditions, deep-rooted superstitions, and the kind of silence that comes from generations of keeping secrets. Here, where wolves still howled in the dark forests and old women crossed themselves when speaking of the ancient burial grounds that dotted the surrounding hills, the boundaries between the natural and supernatural seemed thin as morning frost. Among Grauberg's inhabitants, the Muller family had dwelt on the village's eastern edge for nearly 3 decades. Their stone cottage, built against the hillside where the forest pressed closest to human habitation, stood slightly apart from the other dwellings, connected to the village proper by a narrow dirt path that became treacherous in winter and impassable. During the spring thaw. Wilhelm Muller, a man of 52 years with iron gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people he encountered, had arrived in Grauberg in 1778 with his young wife, Bertha. The couple had claimed to be fleeing religious persecution in the northern German states, carrying with them little more than a cart of possessions and letters of introduction from clergy in distant parishes that no one in Grauberg could verify. Wilhelm presented himself as a scholar of ancient texts and theological matters, a man learned in Latin and Greek who could read the old manuscripts that gathered dust in the village church. This education, rare in such a remote place, earned him a grudging respect from the villagers, though his tendency toward long silences and his wife's peculiar habits kept them at a careful distance. Bertha Muller was a woman whose beauty had once been remarkable but had acquired an unsettling quality over the years. Now approaching her 45th year, she possessed the kind of pale ethereal appearance that seemed to belong more to the realm of spirits than the world of the living. Her hair, once golden, had faded to the color of old parchment, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality that made the blue veins beneath clearly visible. The Mullers attended church services with religious devotion, occupying the same pew each Sunday morning and participating in the rituals with an intensity that bordered on fervor. Yet there was something in their piety that made Father Matthias, the village priest, uneasy. Their prayers seemed to carry an undercurrent of desperation, and their eyes held secrets that even confession could not cleanse. The cottage where the Mullers made their home had been built by Wilhelm himself during their first years in Grauberg. The structure was unremarkable from the outside: thick stone walls designed to withstand the harsh mountain winters, a steep pitched roof to shed the heavy snows, and small windows that admitted little light but retained precious warmth. What made the cottage unusual was its foundation, which Wilhelm had excavated far deeper than necessary for a simple dwelling. Villagers who had assisted with the construction remembered Wilhelm's obsession with the underground portions of the house. He had insisted on digging the cellar himself, working through the nights by lantern light and refusing all offers of help. The sounds of his labor, the scraping of metal against stone, the thud of earth being moved, had continued for months, longer than such work should have required. When questioned about his extensive excavations, Wilhelm had explained that he was creating storage space for the preserved foods and supplies necessary to survive Grauberg's brutal winters. He also mentioned his intention to establish a private study where he could pursue his scholarly work without interruption, surrounded by his collection of ancient texts and religious manuscripts. The completed cottage had indeed included an impressive cellar, accessible through a heavy wooden door set into the kitchen floor. Visitors who glimpsed this space saw stone walls lined with shelves of preserved goods, barrels of grain and ale, and the tools and implements necessary for rural self-sufficiency. However, what they observed was only a small portion of the underground complex that Wilhelm had actually constructed. Over the years, the Mullers had become known in Grauberg for their reclusiveness and their apparent childlessness. This latter circumstance was viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion by their neighbors, as children were considered both a blessing from God and a necessity for survival in such a harsh environment. Bertha's visible longing when she watched the village children play and Wilhelm's awkward attempts to engage with young people during church gatherings only emphasized their perceived loss. The couple's daily routine was as predictable as the changing seasons. Wilhelm would rise before dawn to tend to their small garden and livestock, spending his afternoons in what he claimed was his underground study. Bertha managed the household duties with meticulous care, but her activities were often conducted with an air of secrecy that puzzled their neighbors. She would disappear into the cottage for hours at a time, and when she emerged, she often carried with her the scent of herbs and medicines that seemed unusual for simple household management. Deliveries to the Muller cottage were more frequent and substantial than their apparent needs would suggest. The traveling merchants who ventured up the mountain paths reported selling the couple large quantities of flour, salt, preserved meats, and other staples, far more than two people could reasonably consume. When questioned about these purchases, Wilhelm would explain that they were preparing for particularly harsh winters or building up stores to share with less fortunate neighbors during times of scarcity. The Mullers also acquired materials that seemed unusual for their stated purposes. Large quantities of candles, lamp oil, woolen cloth, and leather goods were delivered to their cottage with suspicious regularity. More puzzling still were the requests for items typically associated with children's small clothing, simple toys, educational materials, and medical supplies that seemed designed for treating young people rather than adults. Local craftsmen remembered strange commissions from Wilhelm over the years. He had ordered the construction of multiple small beds, children's furniture, and storage containers designed for clothing and personal belongings of various sizes. When asked about these items, Wilhelm had claimed they were intended for the orphaned children of relatives who might someday come to live with them, or for charitable purposes within the village community. The most disturbing aspect of the Mullers' presence in Grauberg was the gradual disappearance of children from the surrounding region. Over the course of 2 decades, 7 children had vanished from villages within a day's travel of Grauberg. These disappearances occurred during times of crisis plagues, harsh winters, or periods of social unrest when families were distracted by survival and authorities had little resources for investigation. The missing children had all shared certain characteristics that made their disappearances particularly tragic. They were orphans or children from families too poor or distracted to mount extensive searches. They ranged in age from 5 to 12 years old, young enough to be manageable, but old enough to be trained and controlled. In each case, their disappearance had been attributed to wolves' accidents or the child's decision to seek better opportunities in distant towns. What the villagers of Grauberg did not know was that these 7 children had never left the area. Instead, they had been brought to the Muller cottage during the dark hours before dawn, transported through forest paths that avoided the main roads and human observation. Once there, they had been taken through the visible cellar and into the hidden portions of Wilhelm's underground complex, never to see daylight again. The underground facility that Wilhelm had constructed was a masterpiece of concealment and control. Beyond the visible cellar lay a network of rooms and corridors carved directly from the mountain's bedrock, reinforced with timber and stone, and designed to house human occupants for extended periods. The complex included sleeping quarters for multiple children, a larger room for meals and education, storage areas for food and supplies, and even a primitive but functional system for waste disposal and ventilation. The 7 children who had been imprisoned in this underground world for periods ranging from 2 to 15 years, had been subjected to Wilhelm and Bertha's twisted interpretation of proper education and moral development. They were taught to read and write using religious texts and carefully selected materials that emphasized obedience, submission, and the inherent evil of the outside world. The psychological control exercised over the children was as sophisticated as the physical prison that contained them. Wilhelm, drawing on his knowledge of religious doctrine and human psychology, had created an environment where questioning his authority was not just discouraged, but presented as a form of blasphemy that would result in eternal damnation. The children were taught that they were being protected from a world corrupted by sin, and that their underground sanctuary was a blessed refuge from divine punishment. Bertha's role in maintaining control over the children was equally important, but more subtle. She served as both mother figure and jailer, providing medical care, preparing meals, and offering the emotional support necessary to keep the children psychologically dependent on their captors. Her apparent kindness and concern masked a calculating intelligence that understood how to manipulate young minds through a combination of affection and fear. The children's education was comprehensive, but carefully controlled. They learned to read using biblical texts and religious treatises that reinforced their captors' worldview. They studied basic mathematics, natural philosophy, and practical skills, but all within a framework that emphasized their complete dependence on Wilhelm and Bertha for survival and salvation. That by 1807, the oldest of the imprisoned children had reached young adulthood, having spent most of their conscious lives in the underground complex. They had no memory of the outside world beyond what Wilhelm and Bertha chose to tell them, and their understanding of reality was completely shaped by their captors' twisted interpretation of morality and divine will. The youngest children, who had been taken more recently, still retained some memories of their previous lives, but these recollections were gradually being replaced by the new reality imposed upon them. Wilhelm and Bertha had developed sophisticated techniques for erasing unwanted memories and replacing them with narratives that supported their control over the children's minds and souls. As winter deepened in 1807, the careful balance that had allowed this horrific situation to continue for 20 years was about to be disrupted. Changes in the village of Grauberg, combined with the arrival of new influences from the outside world, would soon threaten the Mullers' ability to maintain their dark secret and control over their victims. The stage was set for a discovery that would expose one of the most disturbing cases of long-term imprisonment and psychological manipulation in the recorded history of rural Europe, and reveal the depths of human cruelty that could exist beneath the facade of respectability and religious devotion. The harsh winter of 1807 had claimed the life of Father Matthias, Grauberg's elderly priest who had served the village for over 30 years. His death from lung fever in February left the small community without spiritual guidance during the darkest months of the year, when the isolation of mountain life pressed most heavily upon the souls of the faithful. It was not until the spring thaw of 1807 that the Bishop of Augsburg was able to send a replacement to this remote parish. Father Benedict Kohler, a young priest of 28 years with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes, arrived in Grauberg carrying with him not only his theological training, but also a curiosity about human nature that would prove crucial to uncovering the Muller's dark secret. Father Kohler had been born in Munich and educated in the best seminaries of Bavaria. Unlike his predecessor, who had been content to maintain the village's traditional ways without question, the new priest brought with him a desire to truly know his parishioners and understand the spiritual challenges they faced in their daily lives. This approach would soon put him on a collision course with Wilhelm and Bertha Muller. During his first weeks in Grauberg, Father Kohler made it his practice to visit every household in the village, introducing himself and assessing the spiritual needs of his new flock. The Muller cottage, situated at the village's edge, was among the last on his list of visits, and when he arrived at their door on a misty morning in early May, he was greeted with a nervousness that seemed disproportionate to his simple pastoral. Called out, Wilhelm and Bertha received their new priest with elaborate courtesy, inviting him into their main room and offering him their best food and drink. However, Father Kohler's trained eye for human behavior noticed several details that struck him as unusual. The cottage was spotlessly clean and well appointed, suggesting a prosperity that seemed inconsistent with Wilhelm's claimed occupation as a scholar of ancient texts. More puzzling still were the sounds that occasionally emanated from somewhere deeper within the house: soft footsteps, the creak of floorboards, and what sounded like muffled voices, though Wilhelm and Bertha gave no indication that anyone else was present. When Father Kohler inquired about these sounds, Wilhelm explained them as settling noises common in old stone houses, or perhaps rats moving through the walls. During their conversation, Father Kohler was struck by the intensity of the Mullers' religious devotion. They spoke of their faith with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism, quoting scripture with remarkable precision and discussing theological concepts with sophisticated understanding. However, their interpretation of Christian doctrine seemed to emphasize themes of punishment, obedience, and separation from the corrupt world in ways that troubled the young priest. Bertha's behavior during the visit was particularly noteworthy. She seemed constantly distracted, frequently glancing toward the kitchen area where Father Kohler had noticed the entrance to the cellar. Her hands trembled slightly when she served tea, and she appeared to be listening for sounds that he could not detect. When Father Kohler attempted to engage her in conversation about her life before coming to Grauberg, her responses were vague and contradictory. The priest's suspicions were further aroused when he observed that the Mullers possessed a remarkable collection of children's items for a couple who claimed to have no offspring. Small shoes by the door, toys partially hidden beneath furniture, and clothing sized for young people were visible throughout the cottage. When he commented on these items, Wilhelm explained that they collected such things for charitable distribution to needy families, though Father Kohler had seen no evidence of such charity during his visits to other village households. Following his visit to the Muller cottage, Father Kohler spent considerable time in prayer and reflection, seeking divine guidance about his growing concerns. His theological training had taught him to recognize the signs of spiritual darkness, and everything about the Muller household suggested secrets that needed to be brought into the light of Christian truth. The priest began conducting discreet inquiries among the villagers about the Muller family's history and behavior. What he learned only deepened his suspicions. Several older villagers remembered the extensive construction work Wilhelm had undertaken when they first arrived, and some recalled the unusual amounts of food and supplies the couple regularly acquired. More troubling still were the stories about missing children from surrounding areas, disappearances that had occurred with suspicious frequency during the Muller's time in Grauberg. Father Kohler's investigation revealed a pattern that was too consistent to be coincidental. Each of the missing children had disappeared during times when the Mullers had been absent from the village for several days, ostensibly traveling to distant towns for supplies or to visit Wilhelm's claimed scholarly contacts. The timing of these absences, combined with the evidence of children's items in the Muller cottage, suggested possibilities too horrible to contemplate. As summer progressed, Father Kohler found himself drawn repeatedly to the Muller cottage, always with legitimate pastoral reasons, but increasingly focused on uncovering the truth behind his suspicions. During one visit in July, he distinctly heard what sounded like children's voices coming from somewhere beneath the cottage. Though Wilhelm and Bertha's explanations about settling timbers and animal sounds became increasingly unconvincing. Priest's breakthrough came during a late evening visit in August, when he arrived at the Muller cottage unexpectedly to offer last rites to what he had been told was a dying relative. Finding the front door unlocked, he entered the cottage calling for Wilhelm and Bertha. In the silence that followed, He clearly heard the sound of children crying somewhere below the main floor. Following the sounds to their source, Father Kohler discovered the entrance to the cellar and descended into what appeared to be a normal storage area. However, his closer examination revealed inconsistencies in the stonework that suggested hidden passages beyond the visible walls. More importantly, he found fresh evidence of multiple people living in the space bedding, personal items, and food scraps that indicated recent habitation by several individuals. The priest's theological training had included instruction in recognizing signs of witchcraft and devil worship, practices that the church had fought against for centuries. The arrangement of items in the hidden portions of the cellar, combined with symbols carved into the stone walls, suggested that Wilhelm and Bertha might be engaged in occult practices that involved the imprisonment and exploitation of innocent children. Father Kohler's discovery of the truth came suddenly and dramatically. While exploring the hidden areas of the cellar by candlelight, he stumbled upon a concealed door that led to the main underground complex. Beyond this threshold, he found a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 7 children, ranging in age from approximately 7 to 22 years, living in conditions that defied Christian conscience. The children's reaction to Father Kohler's appearance was a mixture of terror and desperate hope. They cowered in the shadows like frightened animals, their pale skin and wide eyes evidence of their long imprisonment away from natural light. Their clothing was simple but clean, and they appeared to be physically healthy, though their psychological state was clearly damaged by years of captivity and manipulation. The underground complex itself was larger and more sophisticated than Father Kohler could have imagined. The network of rooms and corridors had been carved from solid rock and fitted with furniture, cooking facilities, and even a primitive chapel where Wilhelm had conducted twisted religious services designed to reinforce his control over the children's souls. The children's initial response to Father Kohler was shaped by years of indoctrination that had taught them to fear outsiders as agents of Satan sent to test their faith. Wilhelm and Bertha had convinced them that their underground sanctuary was protecting them from a world corrupted by sin, and that any contact with the outside world would result in their eternal damnation. However, Father Kohler's gentle approach and obvious religious authority gradually overcame the children's fears. His clerical robes and knowledge of Scripture provided reassurance that he was not the demonic presence they had been taught to expect. Slowly, the oldest of the children began to tell their stories, revealing the full scope of Wilhelm and Bertha's crimes. The children's accounts painted a picture of systematic psychological torture, disguised as religious education. They had been taught that their families had abandoned them to eternal punishment, and that only Wilhelm and Bertha's protection stood between them and the fires of hell. Their underground existence was presented as a form of penance that would eventually earn them salvation, but only if they demonstrated complete obedience to their captors. Father Kohler's confrontation with Wilhelm and Bertha when they returned to the cottage was swift and decisive. Armed with the evidence of their crimes and the authority of the church, he demanded an immediate explanation for the children's imprisonment. Wilhelm's attempts to justify their actions through twisted interpretations of Scripture only confirmed the priest's assessment that he was dealing with individuals who had perverted Christian doctrine to serve their own evil purposes. The rescue of the 7 children from their underground prison marked the beginning of a long and difficult process of rehabilitation and recovery. Father Kohler worked with church authorities and local officials to provide medical care, counseling, and gradual reintegration into normal society for the victims. However, the psychological damage inflicted by years of isolation and manipulation proved to be extensive and long-lasting. Wilhelm and Bertha Muller faced justice through both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The church declared them heretics and excommunicated them for their perversion of Christian doctrine. Local officials, working with representatives from the regions where the children had been taken, pursued criminal charges that ultimately resulted in Wilhelm's execution and Bertha's life imprisonment in a convent dedicated to housing the most dangerous female criminals. The case of the Muller family became a subject of intense study among church scholars and legal authorities throughout Bavaria and beyond. The sophistication of their psychological manipulation techniques, combined with the elaborate physical facilities they had constructed, represented a form of criminal behavior that challenged existing understanding of human evil. The 7 children who had been rescued from the underground complex faced varying degrees of success in their recovery and reintegration into normal society. The youngest, who retained some memories of life before their captivity, eventually adapted to freedom and went on to live relatively normal lives. However, the older children, who had spent most of their conscious existence in the underground prison, struggled with the transition to a world they had been taught to fear and distrust. Father Kohler's role in uncovering and exposing the Muller family's crimes established his reputation as a priest of exceptional courage and insight. He remained in Grauberg for several more years, helping the community heal from the trauma of learning about the evil that had existed in their midst. His detailed documentation of the case provided valuable insights for future church officials and legal authorities dealing with similar crimes. That the Muller cottage and its underground complex were eventually destroyed by church authorities, who declared the site cursed and unsuitable for human habitation. The location was consecrated as holy ground and marked with a cross bearing the names of the 7 children who had suffered there, serving as a permanent reminder of the importance of vigilance against those who would exploit the innocent. Macabre history of the Muller family stands as a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. The 7 children who survived their ordeal, despite the psychological scars they carried, demonstrated that even the most systematic attempts to destroy the soul cannot completely extinguish the divine spark that exists within every human being. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,